What if our theology could get up out of our armchairs and into the real world?
That would be something worth talking about.
This is the Armchair Anabaptist podcast.
Community, loneliness, that might be the great evangelistic opportunity of our time, the great wound in the world that needs healing.
Mixing our faith with a political party is like mixing ice cream and horse manure. It doesn't do much damage to the manure, but it really messes up the ice cream.
It's very early, it's very primal, it's very deep within the human community, is that we are people who do not want to be alone.
I'd love to see us stand more in solidarity with one another, not looking down on one another, but together finding that level ground at the foot of the cross of Jesus and sharing in the hope of the resurrection.
You're listening to the Armchair Anabaptist. I'm Jesse Penner.
And I'm Andrew Dick. This is episode 10, Kleine, Gemeinde.
Buckle in, folks. We are going to be jumping into a real hot topic issue today. This is the one where we're going to get all the response, all the listens, all the mail, I'm sure. This is a real barn burner of an episode where we're sort of putting it all on the table. We're answering the sort of the deepest burning questions of your hearts. I'm sure when you heard we were doing a season on community, what you were really excited for us to talk about was the structure of church governance.
That's it. And I know there's got to be some more nerds out there who love organizational structures and talking about the ins and outs of that. I can't be the only one, right? I can't be the only one. But beyond that, it is really going to be an important thing to talk about. Because if we take a step back and look at our overarching theme of the season being community, then we tie that into the Anabaptist tradition, at least that we are a part of, this focus on small church, priesthood of all believers, a congregational model of church governance. Really, so much of the DNA of the Anabaptist movement is still very much focused on some skepticism of top-down authority within the church, this desire to do things all together as one. And so we can't talk about community without unpacking this a little bit.
Right. It is something that sort of flows through the heartbeat of what it means to be Anabaptist for us. And when I think about growing up in the Evangelical Mennonite Conference, this concept of congregationalism, for me, actually, I think was something that I just assumed to be the way that churches operated. It's only as I got a little bit older that I realized that maybe we've got a bit of a unique thing here in terms of thinking about churches as being led by the people together in community coming together to discern the will of God for that church. And so there are some tough questions that come out of this. There's no question that it is clunky, it can be inefficient, it can lead to division, and certainly Anabaptists are not free of the general stigma that surrounds churches in terms of there being divisions and disunity and things that end up splitting or dividing churches. And congregationalism, when it's not practiced well, can certainly feed into that. And there's lots of question around, is this actually the best model for church these days? And certainly churches within our congregation are often asking that question about what does church governance and church leadership look like in the context of our Anabaptist history.
And certainly some of the situations and stories that we've seen in the North American evangelical church recently, I think this is a good conversation to have now, because we have a healthy skepticism of some of these maybe celebrity pastor-led churches where there's one very charismatic leader, and then you can have an entire movement and family of people in a church that can live and die with just how well this one charismatic individual can lead. And so if Anabaptism looking back historically, saw some skepticism in this top-down leadership model. And even if congregationalism isn't the perfect answer, I think we still find ourselves skeptical today. And while we've had a very diverse group of guests over the course of this season, and today in particular, we wanted to maybe flood the table with Anabaptist perspectives. And so all of our guests are involved with an Anabaptist church or ministry at this point.
Yeah, we're going to be talking with Leighton Friesen, Dave Reimer, Megan Good, and Travis and Rosie Zacharias about these questions around congregationalism, what that looks like. And as you said, they're all from an Anabaptist background. We still get a unique sort of set of perspectives here, as Travis and Rosie are missionaries. Megan Good is a part of a large Anabaptist network that's outside of our EMC context. And Leighton and Dave have both served in the past as leaders of their respective conferences, pastoral leaders there. And so I think it'll be a really good conversation to kind of drill into this. And I think, like you said, these are important conversations to have. It's not typically the sort of stuff of headlines, and yet these are really valuable conversations. And I appreciated the insightful answers that we received that you're about to hear. We're going to start off here with Leighton Friesen. Dr. Leighton Friesen is the academic dean of Steinbach Bible College, as well as the former conference pastor of the EMC, the Evangelical Mennonite Conference in Canada. His most recent book is called Secular Nonviolence and the Theodrama of Peace. We asked him this question: Anabaptist churches traditionally have followed a congregational model of governance. So what does that congregationalism look like today in Mennonite or in Anabaptist churches? Here's Leighton's response.
So in my years as conference pastor, I noticed that a lot of our congregations are struggling in one way or another with this inheritance of congregationalism that we have inherited from our past. And a lot of congregations are finding that this model has become clunky, it's become awkward, it's become slow, it stifles leadership, it stifles mission, it has too many people contributing to the conversation, which kind of fuddles everything up and nothing ever gets done, and it allows people who don't know anything about the situation to speak into the situation. So there's just a lot of problems that people have noticed with this practice of having the whole congregation speaking to all the issues in the congregation on a regular basis. And so a lot of churches there's been some churches that have kind of overreacted to this, I think, but most churches in the EMC struggle with this question at some level. The conclusion that I've come to personally in terms of how I view congregationalism is that I think what congregationalism requires of leaders is the skill and the intent to engage their congregations in conversation about the direction of the church. And so if you want to have a pastor-led church or an elder-led church or a board-led church, that's fine. You can still be congregational. But this pastor or this ministerial or this board or these elders, they need to have regular conversations with the congregation about what the direction of the church should be. It needs to be from the ground up in that sense. And so that doesn't mean going to the congregation for every last decision that needs to be made about the budget or about the furniture or about, the youth ministry or whatever. You don't need to keep going back to pester the congregation about all these things, but the congregation needs to be setting the direction and the mission of the church and giving that to the leadership and saying, here, this is our congregation's vision. This is what we want to do in this community. And it's your job now as leaders to carry that out. And you don't need to come back to us on a monthly basis asking for clarification on that or, how that applies to this or this or this. We trust you to carry that out. But when you do sense that this vision is not working anymore, or it's lacking buy-in from the congregation, or it's misdirected, then what you do is you come back to the congregation. And so there's a regular pattern of conversation that these leaders are having with the church to determine what is in fact the direction the church wants to go. And then the church then trusts the leaders to involve them, to mobilize them, to lead them, to carry out that vision together. I think that's a way to understand congregationalism today. It's not just that the leaders get to set the vision. You can't. That's not congregationalism. If the leaders are the ones casting the vision, that's a different form of church polity. It might be good. I'm not saying it's evil, but it's not congregationalism.
I was excited to be able to sit down with Dave Reimer and hear his response to this question of what congregationalism looks like today. He has a very unique resume. He is currently the president at Steinbach Bible College, but for many years, Dave also spent time mentoring and guiding church leaders and pastors as part of the Christian Mennonite Conference. And so he was able to see things from a few different perspectives. And here is what he added to our conversation.
What does congregationalism look like today? So it changes. So I think there was a time where there's this sense of loyalty, well, an external authority, right? God has spoken, the Bible has spoken, the church has spoken, this is the truth, and I fit myself into that reality. It changes when I am the authority because this church teaches this, but that church teaches that, and so I'll be the one to choose which one of those truths is my truth, right? So there's that shift in the way we think. There's also, it used to be the church would meet very regularly, and now it's Sunday mornings enough for me, or every second Sunday is enough for me, that kind of thinking. And membership meetings, it used to be every member wanted to have a say on every decision, and that's becoming less real. So I think that the dynamic is changing, and I would say some of that isn't just because it's an Anabaptist church or otherwise, but we hire leaders, right? We hire full-time pastors so they can deal with the details and don't call a whole bunch of membership meetings for every detail. Let the leaders, they know more things because they're in the actions so often. Let them make all of those decisions. Call us together once a year to deal with the budget and the vision and leadership elections or something like that, and then let's carry forward. So the expectations, I think, are changing. It's a different dynamic. People are expecting leaders to lead. This is something that I've noticed in our world. And I don't know if this is true in the EMC in the same way, but people are expecting leaders to lead, at least with a proposal. Don't bring the membership together and say, so what do you want to do next? Come, you're the leader. Have you not thought about this? Then don't call a membership meeting until you've thought this through and you have a proposal. Lead. Tell us, what do you see? And then we'll agree, or we'll ask for an adjustment on this. But please lead us. Do some thinking before you call us together. I think that's the way it goes. And leaders in this context need to work hard to develop relationships of trust, so that when you when you think things through and you see needs in the community, that you can present and say, we think this can work. And they'll say, we trust you, Pastor, make it happen.
Travis and Rosie Zacharias are EMC missionaries and church planters in Mingaguazu, Paraguay. They are also involved in camp ministry with Shea Roga. And they spoke in particular about their experience as church planters when I asked them what congregationalism looks like today. Here's their answer.
I think congregationalism works better in churches that have where a large percentage of the members are mature believers who will make a God-guided decision when choosing leaders. And in our context, where it's a church plant, where it's brand new Christians, I don't think it would work very well. When we started the church plant, we were two couples and a single missionary working in our church plant. And we started, obviously, with no believers because we moved to a community where we didn't know a single person. And we started getting to know people, evangelizing. And we started with church services right off the bat. Even when we were just missionaries, we already started weekly Bible studies and church services, just started inviting people to participate with us. And obviously, in a case like that, us as missionaries were leading everything because everybody else was either not Christians or were very brand new. And so it's always been a plural leadership model that we've had here. Some of the missionaries have changed over the years, but we've always maintained the plural leadership. And so we have meetings, we consult with each other. It's important to have good communication. And we've been blessed to have good partners, people we can communicate and work with. And we've never had any real issues in that aspect. Those worked really well. As time moves on, the idea is, because we're here at church planting, the time is to develop leaders within the church, and that we would slowly step back, and with the goal of starting another church somewhere else, whether it be close by or a bit further away, but still giving the support into that context. So it's always you're leading at the same time trying to train. And Paul gives the warning that you can't put a new Christian in as an elder because they might get conceited or might become prideful. And we've seen examples of that happening too in other church plants. And so it's something to keep in mind as well. So our goal is to eventually hand leadership over, hopefully in a plural leadership type style. But we're not too rushed about it, because it seems the consequences of that are just a weak church and a church that will eventually fall apart as well. So it takes patience, but it's been very good. In our context, right now we have about 10 families that would regularly participate in our services. So we tried having congregational meetings for a while, and whether it's because they're more new Christians or it's also cultural as well. But in a congregational meeting, we'd have an immature believer or two that would try to dominate the meeting in an attempt to gain power for themselves. And most believers wouldn't share the opinion because they're just too shy or because they want to avoid conflict. And so we never really got a lot done in congregational meetings. And so what we started doing, we only have about 10 families that are actually really considered members in our church. And so we just started visiting each family independently and asking them about the topics and getting their opinions, and then together with their fellow leaders and taking into account the opinions of the other believers, make decisions. So in a sense, it is top down, but plurality in the leadership, trying to take into context what everybody else says, and then at the same time trying to model servant leadership and humility throughout it all. And as we were thinking about this, it seems to me that the model of governance perhaps isn't the most important factor. The more important factor perhaps is the character of the leaders who are in charge. If you have a solid leader who's humble, who's serving the people, you can have a bit more of a top-down governance style. If you have a congregational-led government, you also need the same humility within your leaders, or you have problems as well. So that's why when Paul gives instructions, whether it's in Timothy or one of the other letters, you look at the characteristics of who the leaders are supposed to be. It doesn't talk about governing style so much. That's kind of assumed, I think. But it's much more the characters of the people that are supposed to be elected. And I think that makes all the difference. Because if you have godly men, godly people that are leading the church, I think things will be okay. And so to me, it seems, the character of the leader seems to be more important than the exact model that we follow.
All right. We've got some great things to chew on there out of those answers, I think. Maybe you're going to get tired of this eventually, but for me, one of the things that came out of the responses we received is, it's contextual, right? Mm-hmm. It depends on your situation, on the context that you're in, on sort of what's going on around you. The answer isn't a simple black and white answer necessarily. There's nuance to it and degrees to it.
Wouldn't it be easier if it was all black and white?
Oh my goodness. I hope you weren't hoping for that when you showed up for the podcast, because it's not sort of what we operate in. We sort of swim around in gray here quite often. But I think we did receive some clarity and some good answers. Just because we are living in gray doesn't mean there weren't good things to say here. Dave and Leighton both really sort of zeroed in on the fact that congregationalism in our context today isn't and probably shouldn't be a direct one-to-one, that every single decision that is being made is always being brought down to some kind of a congregational vote, some kind of a congregational system where everybody is expected to weigh on every single thing. I don't know if it's heretical to compare church to state, in this kind of a context. But looking at democracy, it works that way too, of course. We recognize we live in a democratic system where the people have the power, but that system involves electing people in order to represent our interests and our beliefs. And then it's not a direct democracy where every single thing gets brought down to a vote across the entire country. There's degrees to that democracy. And I think there was a recognition for the need for congregationalism to have some of that nuance as well, where yes, it is something that is led by the people of the church coming together in discernment to understand the vision that God has for their church. But it is also something that involves and requires leadership that is going to take things and work with things in a way that doesn't involve every piece of the congregation and every decision.
So both Leighton and Dave, those two responses brought forward a notion of hybrid congregationalism and probably even the benefit and necessity of that. And with it comes responsibilities. And so if we are going to be in church communities that have a hybrid form of congregationalism, then of course that requires the congregation to trust their leaders to lead, to empower them to do so. To say, we have hired a pastor, now we've given you a task, we've given you a role, now go and fulfill that task and play that role. Or we've voted on elders and we've empowered you to make certain decisions on behalf of us as the congregation. Now we are going to empower and enable you the room to do this. And then in order for this to work, there's also accountability on the other end of the spectrum, where as a pastor and as an elder or a deacon or a leader in a church, you are making these decisions on behalf of what's in the best interest of the congregation. You're listening to them. You're taking their feedback into consideration. And so I think we can really see a path forward on where a hybrid model would work well. But of course, that's going to take room and movement and relationship on both the leaders' parts and the congregation's parts.
And when we recognize that sort of a balance that is required, we also recognize that the congregational model brings with it opportunity for exploitation or for imbalance. The fact is that our churches are set up in such a way as to try and spread that power around in a proper way. And we have bylaws and systems and constitutions and policies in place that help us to do this well. But we also recognize that despite what our policies might say, or despite what our best intentions might be, it's possible for a pastor to come in and sort of seize power in a situation. For a certain set of families, this is a good Mennonite thing, right? For a certain set of families within a church to end up wielding sort of an outsized amount of power where they certainly seem to be the ones in control, even if on paper it shouldn't be that way. And so we kind of dug into this a little bit with the panel guests that we have today and asked this question. We understand what a congregational church maybe should look like in its idyllic form, in its sort of Platonic form. But in reality, where does power reside in Anabaptist church communities? What can end up happening there? So we're going to talk about that after the break.
The second question that we asked our panel of guests today is, where does power reside in many Anabaptist church communities? I want to introduce Megan Good to our discussion. Dr. Megan Larissa Good is lead pastor at Trinity Mennonite Church and the theology chair of the Jesus Collective. She is also the author of several books, including Divine Gravities, Sparking a Movement to Recover a Better Christian Story. And this is how she answered that question.
I kind of laughed when I first read this question because I thought there's such a difference between where does it and where should it and where do we intend for it. And those are all different questions. The Anabaptist community theologically, I think, has had a very valuable thread of our tradition that we have preserved a strong theological sense of the priesthood of believers, which is, I understand to be a way of saying the Spirit of God empowers and qualifies all followers of Jesus for ministry. That there's no two different classes of humans. Every person who follows Jesus, who's been given the Spirit of Jesus, is holding a piece of the church's ministry and mission. And one specific extension of that, given at Pentecost, is that the Holy Spirit can speak through anyone and everyone. Every person is qualified to speak on behalf of God, which was truly revolutionary. That was one of the biggest shifts that happened with the coming of the Spirit. However, in practice, I think Anabaptists have had a blind spot, which I think is perhaps a misunderstanding of our kind of vision of the priesthood of believers, and not taking leadership seriously as a gift and a calling. And the result of that, I guess in my experience and practice, is that in Anabaptist churches, power often ends up revolving around the most forceful person in the room, or the most manipulative person in the room, or the family group that has the most social power and holds the purse strings. So power comes in all sorts of places. It comes from personality, from the length of time that you've been in a community, from having the last name that everyone trusts, from your field of social connections. And all of those invisible power markers are very strongly operative in a lot of our communities. And I've talked to a whole lot of people who've been a part of Anabaptist churches for decades who still felt disempowered because they didn't have those particular markers. So I think Anabaptists are right in their vision of the priesthood of believers, and in every person having the ability to hear from God, to speak for God, to be operative in ministry. But I think that's fully compatible with a view of community that says leadership itself is a gift and a call, and that part of the community's role is to discern where God is moving in and on people for that charisma of leadership. And we have our critiques to make of how leadership has played out perhaps in other churches and traditions, and those are fair critiques. But the answer to that, I think, is not to dissolve leadership, is to say we need to be measuring it by different things. For example, by the fruit of the Spirit, by willingness to sacrifice on behalf of people, by the ability to repent and turn. We have Jesus given markers of what good leadership looks like. And so I guess my dream for the Anabaptist tradition is that we would fully embrace our vision of the priesthood of believers, and also find a way to honor leadership within that mutually submissive model of how we are together, and understand its importance, so that power can actually be discerned and not just defaulted to by these invisible forces that we don't like to acknowledge are operative.
In my discussion with Megan on this subject, I was reminded of a lesson that I learned in seminary, where my professor was talking to us as pastors and leaders and future leaders about how power can be abused in the church in two ways. I mean, we often think about power being abused when leaders take too much of it, and they grab power that is not theirs, or then they use the power that might be rightfully theirs, but they use it selfishly and for their own gain. But my professor made the point that problems can arise and that power can be abused on the other end of the spectrum, where we as leaders would abdicate power that's rightfully ours. We would release it. We would be so afraid to take too much of it that we don't use the power that's rightfully been given to the office or to the role that we're trying to play. And this type of power doesn't just dissolve to nowhere. It goes somewhere else. And if we abdicate power that's ours, rightfully ours, then it will go somewhere that it's not intended to be. And there's some danger with this as well. When I talked to Megan about this, she responded by saying the following.
Well, the theologian David Fitch has a new book coming out that I just read called Reckoning with Power, that I've been thinking about a lot. And he talks in that book even about needing to recover and understanding of different kinds of power, the difference between worldly power, for example, and what you might call godly power. And I think that's part of the secret, is that power language has been so contaminated by the ugly worldly forms of abuse over people. And sometimes we forget there's a healthy, beautiful gospel language of power, which only God can give, and that comes with the anointing of God for a particular purpose. And that godly power is not under our control, right? We can't determine when it shows up. We can't manipulate it. Like that's something that only God can give. But we should be watching for it, celebrating it, making room for it, when it flows. And I don't know, sometimes I think we're in danger of having, Paul talks about a gospel that's been kind of emptied of its power, right? And so we have the right line, but don't expect anymore the power of God to show up and to back the movement that God desires to see. So making room for that.
We also talked to Leighton Friesen again about the same question. Where does power end up residing in Anabaptist church communities?
Well, I think in any community, including the church, including a Jesus-centered community, if you leave things alone, then power is going to reside in the wealthy. It's going to reside in the articulate, in the well-bred, in the educated, in the people who are part of the ruling family in the congregation or whatever. If things are kind of left to their own, then power is going to be distributed according to very human-based kinds of criteria. And that's just the natural drift of human community. And so if a church wants to distribute power in any way other than that, it's going to have to work against the stream. It's going to have to walk against the wind in intentionally creating structures and processes that are going to resist that kind of human-based distribution of power. One of the ways that churches traditionally have curbed this human-based power distribution is by creating processes of selecting leaders and anointing leaders that are meant to transcend just, who's the most powerful, who's the most wealthy, who's the most educated. And this is where I keep coming back to our whole practice of ordination. I think ordination is one way to prevent power from being distributed in only human kinds of ways. It's actually a spiritual practice of discernment that a church goes through, that tests people, that trains people, that selects people according to spiritual biblical criteria, which will, if it's done well, I think it in the long run prevents only the rich or only the well-connected from gaining power. And so I think that we can't just sort of throw off all these structures and all these practices that have been there in the church. I think they need to be examined. They need to be redirected to make sure that they're still in line with scriptural principles of leadership and authority. But these practices of discerning our leaders and of testing them and of granting them a measured authority within the church, a bounded authority within the church, those are actually there to prevent power from running off the rails and just looking like the power that gets shared in any other kind of human community. The other way in which a church, I think, distributes power in a healthy way is by making sure that there's healthy accountability between leaders in the church. And so in our context, in the EMC, for example, many churches have both a ministerial, that is a kind of a pastoral spiritual leadership, as well as an elder board or a council, a church board that looks after more of the business side of the church, the programs of the church. I think there is a validity to that kind of distribution of power. It needs to be done in a way that doesn't stifle the church. Sometimes we have so many checks and balances between the different committees in the church that nothing really ever moves or gets done. And that's an overcorrection, I think, to a fear of people gaining power. But there does need to be checks and balances within the church. And so when you have certain people who are in charge of the finances of the church, other people who are in charge of programs in the church, other people who are in charge of the ministry of teaching and preaching in the church, of the worship, children's, when all of these people are working together, I think there is an accountability and there's a check and balance that works there to prevent any one particular person from abusing their power. Now, that can always be abused, and any human system will be abused. But I think there are things that churches can do to prevent purely human instincts from taking over and just assigning power to the people who are the most assertive and grabbing it for themselves.
Dave Reimer also weighed in on our discussion about the question, where does power reside in many Anabaptist church communities today?
Where is it supposed to reside, in a congregational model, or where does it actually reside? It seems to me that regardless of your church's theological framework, every community has certain power holders, and we have to be aware of that. And power isn't a bad thing. Power is given by God to certain people in certain circumstances for the betterment of the community. And so power exercised properly makes us strong. So it's not, we shouldn't be thinking about it in bad terms. But power in any given circle, regardless of what the structure of the church is, someone's got education. They've got power because they have answers. Somebody's got experience. They've got answers. And so when that person who's 80-year-old and he's been pastoring for 50 years and he's experienced these things over and over, that person, when they speak, get more attention than me or you would. Money. Somebody's got money. That gives them a certain power in certain conversations. Somebody's got family connections. That therefore you listen, right? The ramifications, the fallouts, right? Somebody's got relationships. It's not what you know, it's who you know sometimes. There's power there. This is something that I've noticed when I speak up and I've got the big voice, then all of a sudden that carries a certain amount of power. And that's not the same as your educational or experience power, but something. And we need to be careful how we use those power pieces when we walk into different communities, right? And different settings. But so people will have also confidence in the decision that happens in community. If somebody has spoken and said, this is how it is, then you might wonder, is this actually going to work? But when we have made a decision together as a community, we walk away with a confidence that the whole community is buying in and following the direction that has been declared. And so that, to me, there's the individual power, but then there's the power of the community when it speaks with one voice. And that's that congregational piece. That's maybe that Anabaptist piece that we should consider.
Finally, we'll hear again from Travis and Rosie Zacharias, and they were able to speak once more to their context as missionaries and the way in which this plays out in their unique context. Here's Travis and Rosie.
In our context here, the power resides with us, I would say. We've just working with immature believers. We always try to making decisions. We try to always take into account the congregation's opinion, but we're not going to have a meeting and what color to paint the church. We're not going to ask people. We're just going to paint it. We're going to make that decision ourselves because it's not worth the fight. It's not worth because they won't agree. Nobody will agree. And so it'll probably be yellow again.
Because you make the decision.
Because I make the decision.
Yeah. So in our context, that's really what it. Yeah, in our specific context, we try to have a plurality of leadership with us together with our coworkers. We have another couple that helps with the teaching, and we have another young man who's in Bible school who also helps with the teaching. And we try to take all of their opinions into account and ask for wisdom from different people, perhaps people who understand the local culture a little bit better than we do. And at the same time, usually the final say would land on our shoulders. We've never had elections in our church yet, basically because, who else would they elect at this point, to be honest? And if they had to elect a deacon, I don't think they could because everybody would have
a reason to not trust that person.
Yeah, everybody would have a reason not to trust somebody else, and so it'd be very hard to find someone. Even we have
to trust us, or as missionaries. There's a trust towards us, but towards their fellow citizen, it's very hard.
Yeah. And a lot of that is because of clashes they've had with each other on a personal level. because of immaturity, because of certain sins in their lives that they're still dealing with and working through. We have people taking turns leading church services, teaching Sunday school. And even at that level, it's like we get the comments, this person should not be leading the church service. They're not
spiritually mature enough, or they have this sin in their life. And
yeah. And so if we would have a vote on those issues, we wouldn't have anybody elected, and we'd probably just have everybody fighting with each other. So we just kind of ask people on a weekly, like on a Monday, I'll ask one family, do you guys want to, as a family, do you want to share the church service on Sunday? And they usually say yes. I have 3 or 4 families that I ask. With Sunday school, it's the same thing. We have a couple teenagers and a couple ladies that teach Sunday school. And so we make those calls, and some people will complain to us about it, and then we can have that conversation with them about how holy does someone have to be to have which responsibility within the church, how mature do they have to be. And so it's good opportunities to converse, and we're not avoiding those conversations either. Growing up, or should I say growing up, in some of the churches we've seen in Canada where it is congregational led, as I said before, the board usually has a lot of power, which they're elected to do their jobs. And the issue is that sometimes churches become led more in an administrative way as opposed to a spiritual way, depending which part of the board gets too much power. And I know that in certain Mennonite churches, especially before, when communities were more strictly Mennonite and more closed, then certain families would certainly get more power, even in those congregational-led governments. And you see the same things when you hear stories coming out of some of the colonies, say here in Paraguay or in Bolivia. There is certainly abuse of power within those supposedly congregational-led churches as well.
I really liked how we did some myth busting when it comes to power and the notion of power in the church. And we heard from the guests talk about how and acknowledge how power is not an inherently bad thing. It's not evil. It's not negative. It's not a swear word. This is something that does, it's a reality, and it actually has appropriate places to reside in the church. And so I think we needed to get that out of the way, and then to give some freedom to leaders being empowered to have appropriate amounts of power. So we need to, again, get rid of some of these negative mindsets before we can have a productive conversation on where this power should be and where it should not be. But I was grateful for that to free us up to talk about this in this way.
Right. An acknowledgement of the fact that it exists and it's there. And as you talked about and Megan talked about a little bit, this recognition that if we aren't good stewards of that power in whatever context, if we aren't thinking well and intentionally about these things, then inevitably what's going to happen is this power is going to make its way to certain areas of our church. And Leighton kind of pointed out the fact, and we had other guests touch on this as well, but Leighton pointed out the fact that where it's going to end up in is the connected, the wealthy, the educated and articulate, and it's going to inevitably end up isolating or marginalizing certain parts of our community. And so Leighton gave some tips when he talked about ordination, when he talked about clear accountability structures between our church and its leadership as ways to intentionally combat and to intentionally create a sort of environment where power can be wielded in appropriate and God-honoring ways.
Yeah, and that notion of stewarding power is very good. I appreciate you bringing that word forward, Jesse. I think that's really giving voice to a lot of what we've talked about and heard, that power exists and it can be used well and it can be used poorly. And it's not ours, but we are given it sometimes as leaders in the church. And how do we use that? Do we use that again for ourselves and for our own selfish gain and desires, or are we able to be stewards of it? Recognizing it doesn't belong to us, it's not for us, it's been given to us, and we need to take good care of it or use it in such a way that benefits our community. And Dave Reimer, in his final response, gave us a really good picture of what this can look like when it's done well. That we have these notions of individual power, whether it's just through wealth and influence and connectedness or in places of leadership, regardless of how that power is acquired, when we come together as a community and unified and pool this power and pull in the same direction and come together behind a decision, when we speak with that one voice, then that is much more powerful in the aggregate than it is on this individual basis.
Right. Seeing the power that we might have within our contexts as something that we can use to bless the body of Christ is a really good postural way to approach this, and helps to safeguard against some of the dangers or fears that come with this idea of power distribution within our Christian communities.
Our feature song is Something to Say by Peters and Pilgrim. Enjoy.
Well, this song should have something to say, but I have so little. So let my words be few, and with this melody, let my song be for you. I will worship you.
The Armchair Anabaptist is a Theodidactos podcast, and Theodidactos is a publication of the Evangelical Mennonite Conference.
You can check us out online at www.thearmchairanabaptist.ca and find us on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are found.
A special thanks to our guests who have joined us today. We spoke with Leighton Friesen, Megan Larissa Good, Dave Reimer, and Travis and Rosie Zacharias.
Our intro song is Making Us One by Shades, and our closing song this episode is Something to Say by Peters and Pilgrim.
Our executive producer is Erica Fair. Our producer and audio engineer is Jesse Penner, and our administrative assistant and social media manager is Betty Ramones. I'm Andrew Dick.
And I'm Jesse Penner, and we have been your hosts for the Armchair Anabaptist. We certainly hope that what you have heard today will do more than stay as merely food for thought, but that it can help inspire each of us to get up out of the comfort of our armchairs and translate into living more like Jesus.
Join us next time as we look at excommunication. Are we really going to go there, Jesse?
Well, I could tell you, but then I'd have to ban you.
Find out, episode 11, The Ban.